Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us for the 23rd edition of the World Sustainability Development Summit. My name is Meenu Saini. I'm an Associate Fellow at Industrial Energy Division at TERI and will be emceeing today's proceeding. Before we commence this session, a brief safety announcement. TERI is a health, safety and environment certified organization. In case of any upward incident like fire, evacuation is required. You are required to exit from this hall from the nearest exit gate without any panic. Moving to the session, we are delighted to introduce an outstanding lineup for the speakers for the session focusing on navigating the energy trilemma in a resource-constrained world. We have with us Mr. Sumit Sinha, founder, chairman, and CEO of Renew Power Private Limited. Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General, the International Solar Alliance. Lord Arya Turner, Chair, Energy Transition Commission. Dr. Priyantha Vijayatunga, Senior Director of Energy, Asian Development Bank. Mr. Girish Sethi, Senior Fellow and Senior Director, TERI. Ambassador Erner Walter, former Secretary General of International Energy Forum. We have a video message from Dr. Domiogo Ogumi, CEO and Special Representative of UN Secretary General for Sustainability Energy for All. Leading the discussion will be Ms. Urmi Goswami, Assistant Editor at Economic Times. I now invite Mr. Goswami to take the floor.
Good afternoon and welcome to this session. Of course, we will be spending the next hour talking about what it means to address the energy trilemma in a resource and climate-constrained world. And obviously, the energy trilemma has three broad pillars: security, sustainability, equity, which would be affordability and access. And the clean energy transition, because we are calling it a trilemma, obviously it implies there are trade-offs. And whereas in this session we'll be focusing on the big ones, the biggest one being finance, but there are other sort of issues that we would like to touch upon as well. When it comes to finance, the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration sort of came down to the figure of 4 trillion a year required by 2030 for clean technology. But money flows, as we know, have not exactly been very forthcoming. Or let's put it this way, most of the money goes to the developed world and China. Africa gets the least where the need is the highest. Countries like India finance most of the clean energy through domestic resources. But security has other aspects as well. But how do we define energy security? I mean, the gap between primary energy, which is what we refer to when we are talking about security, and final energy, which is when we are talking about access, we refer to final energy. There's a 66% loss on an average. How do we address that? How do we ensure that, when it comes to sustainability, we again talk in terms of, planetary boundaries, but it's also a sustainability of spend. The IEA says that the cost of an LNG terminal is 25 billion, and Africa needs 25 billion a year so that everybody there has access to modern energy. So, which is a more sustainable spend? How do we overcome these issues? Of course, there are policy challenges, regulatory challenges, and of course, and the other big picture of the piece is critical minerals. Again, that one factor ensures that we can't write geopolitics out of this equation. And when it comes to equity, there is also a question. We talk in terms of affordability and access, but also externalities. So that needs to be addressed as well. Now, I'm very lucky to have a panel of very notable men to address. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one. But I'm sure that a lot of notable women will ask questions at the end of the session. So be prepared. I will, for my ease, not anybody else's, use the seating order to start off this discussion. Lord Turner, you go first, but before you do, I want you to address this gap between primary energy and the losses we have all the way up to final energy. Not about usable, because that's conservation, or that's conservation, efficiency. But if you...
Great. Well, you did give me a little bit of warning, like 3 minutes, that you're going to ask me this question, but it is an interesting question. Have a look at the IEA's net zero scenario produced in November, and you'll find they suggest that a world can achieve huge increases in prosperity, but actually use less final energy than it does today, and far less primary energy. And that sounds a bit surprising. The single biggest reason for that is the energy efficiency improvement, which automatically comes from electrification. An internal combustion engine turns about 25% of the input energy into what you want, which is kinetic energy to drive the car forward, and turns 75% into heat, which you didn't want to come out of that car engine. An electric car engine in an EV achieves a 90 or 95% efficiency. And that's why when we electrify our transport fleets, we will use far less even at the final energy level, let alone at the primary energy level. When we get rid of fossil fuel thermal generation, we stop turning 60 or 70% of the energy into coal, into heat that we have to get rid of in cooling towers, rather than the electricity that we want, where when we produce it from wind or solar, it is coming in electricity in the first form. And when we take heat pumps, my house in London is at the moment heated in winter with a gas boiler. At the very most, with a condenser boiler, you'll get about 80% efficiency. This year, I'm changing it to a heat pump, where I will put in 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, and I will get 3.5 kilowatt hours of heat for every 1 kilowatt hour that we put in. So let's be clear, the biggest single thing that we need to do to improve energy efficiency across the world and to reduce that energy demand is to electrify. For that to be compatible with the climate, we have got to decarbonize all of that electricity supply, and I hope we can do it in almost all countries of the world by 2050. And the fundamental way we will do that is renewable energy plus nuclear. And the great thing about renewable energy plus nuclear is that they are largely the way round the security part of the dilemma. Because although the resources of renewable supply are not evenly distributed across the world, there is far more in Australia than there is in, say, Malaysia, they are far more evenly distributed than fossil fuels. Pretty much every country in the world has some supply of renewables, whereas fossil fuels has been allocated by the processes of geological formation to very particular parts of the world. For a fossil fuel economy is by definition an economy with very significant international trade, where some people will be making huge economic rents from it, others will be dependent and worried about that dependency on imports. So the electrification and decarbonization and the shift to renewable energy and to decarbonized renewable energy, to electrification and to decarbonized energy is automatically a way to security. So if I have one simple message, because it has to be simple because we don't have much time each, given that there's 8 of us, electrify, 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 decarbonize with renewables and nuclear, and you will end up with a more energy efficient and a more secure energy system.
Sorry, I made a small mistake. I forgot. We do have Dr. Damiola Ogunbi's video message, so that takes care of the notable men. Not that that makes any one of you less notable. We'll come to her, say, halfway through this. Next, I turn to you, Sumant. One of the things Lord Turner mentioned was about moving to renewable, which will take care of this, loss that we have in primary energy. I'm wondering, what is the biggest challenge, policy, regulatory, not finance, beyond that? What are those constraints that you have, which makes this a part of the, why we are talking about the trilemma? If you could sort of focus on that.
Yeah, thank you first of all, Urmi, and thank you to TERI for having us on here, even though it's a group of men with a video message from a woman. But at least you are there. And we cannot count you out of this group. Okay. That is true. Okay, so anyway, but I didn't put this panel together, so I absolved myself of that responsibility. But look, coming back to your question of what needs to be done. So first of all, while I'm going to talk about the challenges, I don't want people to feel that it's very difficult and it's, how do we get it done and so on and so forth. I think the first thing to realize is that there is a massive, massive, massive opportunity that is staring us in the face. And we are going to have to change the fundamentals of our entire energy system that has been built up over the last maybe 200 years. And it's not just the generation side, but the entire user side as well has to be changed, right? Which is all the electric vehicles. I mean, the vehicles, for example, aviation fuel, shipping fuel, so many industrial processes that are based on fossil fuels, which also have to therefore undergo change. So there is going to be a massive opportunity in this transition in multiple different ways, right? Now, the question is why is it a challenge? It's a challenge because of the scale of what we need to do. The scale is just enormous. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And when you trot out numbers of trillions of dollars, most people don't, it's very hard for people to assimilate that, right? So to make it very simple for people to understand, we know that in the fossil fuel industry, it's sort of been the fulcrum around which a lot of our global geopolitics has revolved, right? But the total investment that we've been making in the fossil fuel industry so far, every year, has at most been $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, right? And now we're talking about investing 2 or 3 times of that every year in renewables and in the downstream user areas of electricity, right? So that gives you a sense of how much bigger this opportunity is, what needs to be done compared to what we have been used to so far. And, as I said, I don't want to get into the geopolitics again, but it's a mammoth ask. And therefore, you will have a total reshaping of the economic order. You'll have a total reshaping of how countries are positioned on the energy spectrum. And all of that is going to lead to a lot of change. Now, countries that are able to move faster on this change process will obviously benefit. And countries that move slower will not be able to benefit as much. Now, so therefore, what are the challenges? The challenges essentially are that when we look at this pace of this, or the scale of the challenge, that itself is the first challenge, which is just a very big problem to solve. The second thing is that right now, while a lot of countries have been making pledges, there's very little actual action that is happening behind it. And part of the reason is that decision making is not it's not monolithic in that many different governmental arms are involved. So, for example, if you want permits or land acquisition, right, that can be sitting, and I'm not just talking about India, I'm talking globally, that can be sitting in the hands of local governments. And they may not want to give permits or they may not want to give land. So I think that process of permitting and environmental clearances and all of those things is one of the big constraining factors that we are now finding. Less so in India, but more so in other parts of the world. The second thing that we actually are going to have a challenge with, as Adair says, electrify everything, right? But you have to move the electricity around. And therefore, you need to build transmission lines. And today, it's not clear that we're building transmission lines fast enough or that there is enough thought behind it. And to give you a simple example, in the US, there are 7 different transmission zones. And they don't talk to each other very well. And there's no single entity that sits and decides what the interconnect capacity should be between all of these different zones. And so if you want to generate the power in the middle of the US and move it to the eastern coast or the western coast, you can't do that because there's no transmission capacity. Now, it would appear very simple for somebody to sit down and say, okay, let's build this, but it's not happening. Okay, whether it's because of the fractious political environment or whatever be the case, I don't know, but it's not happening. Okay, so it's simple things like that, right? The third thing is diversity of, or just the supply chain itself. Today, the entire supply chain sits in China. That's the basic reality of our business right now, right? Now, The question is, what happens if there's a pandemic in the future or some other geopolitical event? We cannot be fully dependent on China as one single country to basically make this whole transition happen. So we need to diversify supply chains. We need to have India manufacturing more and more solar panels all the way to polysilicon. We need the US or maybe other parts of the world to be doing that. And again, that's not happening fast enough because it's very easy for a lot of countries to say, you know what, China is just selling it to us at half the price that we can make it ourselves, so let's just keep buying it from them. And they're also very good at perpetuating that dependence. Because whenever any country starts saying that we want to set up a domestic industry, prices suddenly go down. Okay, now whether that's thought through, whether that's just by coincidence, God alone knows. But it is happening, right? Even today, as the US and India are trying to set up domestic industries, suddenly solar panel prices have fallen by half, which is of course great, but it's also making it harder for people to set up capacities, right? So because then every country starts saying, do I really want to subsidize so much, or should I just keep buying from China? So I think that's another aspect that we have to deal with. The fourth, of course, is financing. You said we won't talk about financing, so I won't talk about it. But the fifth issue is really just the scale of actually executing all of these projects. You know, if we have to, for example, do, let's say, 50, 60 gigawatts of renewables in India every year, we've been doing about 15 or 20 gigawatts at max. 50, means we need to do a lot of wind, we need to do a much more amount of solar. How do you have enough people to do that? Do you have enough trained people to do that? So that is also going to be an issue. And then grid management. As all of this intermittent renewable energy comes into the grid, how do you manage the grid? I think that's another big aspect that has to be looked at. For that, you need batteries, and battery costs are high. They've, of course, come down a lot, but they need to come down even more, right? And then you have to look at what kind of solutions will become most viable. In India, we have these round-the-clock power solutions, which are wind, solar, and storage. But maybe in the future, only solar and storage becomes cheaper, or do you have pumped hydro? So how do you manage the grid? Which entity does that? So all of those are also involved in this issue. So I think those are some of the challenges that we will have to solve if we are to meet this huge number.
Thank you. I was wondering if I may, you mentioned about having to add on so much capacity. One of the issues we see is the, like rooftop solar. That seems to be an area where movement doesn't seem to happen much, especially in developing countries. I'm wondering if you could sort of address that. What needs to move there for actually getting to that 50 number that you mentioned, in India's case, but anywhere else? Yeah.
No, I think we'll get to that 50 number even without the rooftop, because right now the pace of auctions in India has stepped up dramatically. Then there's the C&I opportunity as well. At some point, green hydrogen will kick in as well. So I think 50 is going to become achievable. But yes, I think rooftop is something that definitely we need to have more of, because A, it democratizes the whole installation. But the problem in India is that, for residential customers in most of the country, electricity prices are subsidized. So, so if somebody has to pay for it, then they'll obviously see, on the one hand, I'm potentially getting for free. On the other hand, it's going to cost me something. So why do I need it? And then secondly, you need to be able to sell that power when you're not at home. Then you need to be able to sell that power to the grid. And you need net metering and so on to be in place. You need smart meters for that. But then also you need to have an appropriate tariff at which the DISCOM is able to buy it from you. And DISCOMs have been very shy of doing that, because their view has been that if suddenly I have to start buying from people, then it's just going to make my whole grid management a lot harder. And what price should I pay them? So they want to pay a very low price, right? And so it becomes very complicated. Now I think the Prime Minister's, very clearly decided that he wants more rooftop solar. Yeah. And I think when the Prime Minister decides, I think it's going to happen.
Turner, did you want to say something?
Just very quickly, I think there is huge opportunity in rooftop solar on residential rooftop. I think there's also huge opportunity in commercial rooftop. And there, I think, across the whole world, we should be going for pretty strong regulation. I don't think people should be allowed to build, an open plan car park which doesn't have a roof over it with solar PV panels on it. I don't think people should be allowed to build factories or distribution centers, brand new ones, which don't have rooftop on top. We need to just really force rooftop solar onto the top of every commercial building across the world. And that in itself will be a very significant opportunity.
I'll tell you one of the other problems we have with rooftop solar, last point, is that you have so much pollution in most of northern India that rooftop solar panels don't generate as much power as you thought they would. And so the entire financials become a little bit wonky. So if there's a lot of subsidy, then of course it makes sense to do it. But otherwise, from a pure financial math standpoint, a lot of customers will think twice about it.
Yeah, so suddenly the energy trilemma is so much more than, just a trilemma. Dr. Mathur, I come to you next. As the man charged with making solar popular across the world, and we heard both Lotara and someone talk about, mindset issues and the way things are. I'm wondering if you could dip into your experience and talk about how difficult it becomes. I mean, say when you were trying to push solar in Africa, you suddenly also have governments saying, hey, we're going to invest in gas because we need power now. I mean, it's almost like the sustainability question, both in terms of sustainability of the investment, but also sustainability of the planet goes for that big trade-off comes into play. And I'm wondering how can we address that issue? Since you have to do it anyhow, you might as well tell us.
Thank you very much. And again, as one of the men in suits, listen, the point that you pointed it out works. Approximately 10 or maybe 20 years ago, I was at a panel in the COP where all men wearing blue suits, all men wearing red ties. And this was pointed out. Now if you talk to the same organization, you won't see that. You will see probably more women and fewer men. And no red ties, certainly.
And for record, both Sumat and Lotara are not wearing.
Exactly. But I am. It's not red. That's true. Long story short, one of the major issues is, of course, what you told us not to talk about, which was financing. Or was that only meant for Suman? Okay, good. So financing is one of the key issues that concerns Africa. We have had something of the order of $400 billion worth of financing in solar globally last year, 2023. But less than 3% went to Africa. So that's the first issue. So we talked to a large number of investors, particularly private sector investors, about why is financing not going in. And the answer we got was that, number one, they were not sure whether they would get a return on their investment. Number two, they weren't clear whether there was a pipeline of projects. And number three, they weren't sure whether there were people who would develop the projects. To me, these things are at the heart. Let's come to the second point, which is how do you enable a project pipeline to occur? The way project pipelines have formed everywhere in the world, including India, is when the public policies push for it, which means regulatory support. Now, this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because regulatory support is great. But if regulatory support is not at the same time accompanied by the flow of money, then it becomes a problem. And this is the problem that plagues Africa right now. Short point, one of the key issues that addresses this issue and the first issue, which is that of getting returns, is the issue of perceived risk. And I call it perceived because when you look at the loans for solar in Africa, less than 2% have actually defaulted. So that is why I call it a perceived risk issue. Now, what has actually happened is much of the payment is made post the date on which it had to be made. So there's delayed payments. Consequently, a payment guarantee mechanism which would at least provide payments to investors for the duration till they get their money paid back. And typically it's about 90 days or so, is what is needed to help monies come in. As this happens, we also need to ensure that, number one, the private sector can invest. Number two, that there are either with the communities or with the power purchase or with the utilities, there are power purchase agreements which work. Initially, you would need guarantees by the countries, country-level guarantees, but later on, these guarantees could be provided by other agencies as well. So I would suggest that guarantees becomes one of the cornerstones, with regulatory inputs being the second. The third issue is that there are places in Africa, Ethiopia for example, where solar already makes economic sense, but it doesn't develop. And the answer lies in what both Adair and Sumant mentioned, which is the fact that how do you take it out? How do you get the grids there? Grid development becomes important. Now, one of the problems is to how many places do I develop the grid? And therefore, making pockets where solar can, or solar and wind and batteries can exist, need to be chalked out. Transmission lines made so that people like Sumant have the reasonable confidence that the electricity that they generate from solar will actually move out. The last issue is when you are replacing fossil fuels, the capital cost is much higher, even though the actual cost per kilowatt hour may be less. Sumant, you were probably one of the first people to win a round-the-clock tender. Ujjwal Bhattacharya from the NTPC is sitting here. They recently won a large tender. All of these are at prices which are less than the price of electricity from new coal. But the capital cost is twice that of coal-based power stations, which means that the capital needs are huge. You know, in this country, we invest about 15% of the GDP on the electricity sector. 15%, that's pretty large. Imagine if it becomes 30%, doubling. Where will that money come from? The only way this can happen is by enhancing the volume, the velocity of money. You invest in projects, and you get the money out as soon as possible. Within 2 years, as soon as it becomes an operating asset, Sumant should be able to convert that operating asset into maybe something that is funded by bonds and release the loan so that it can be used to provide investment to a new project which is coming up. I believe that the issue of regulations, the issue of financing, the issue of land, the issue of transmission lines, and coming back, the issue of the overall capital availability in the systems are what is pushing this back. Now, all of this is not helped by the fact that in Africa, there's a very strong lobby for the development of gas infrastructure. The problem is, this gas infrastructure will become non-viable, non-economically viable in the foreseeable future, even before it has had a time to return the investment. What happens then? This implies that there is also a need for advocacy, providing the information that is needed in terms of countries can then make an informed choice based on what their own projected roadmaps are. I can go on forever, but let me stop here now.
I will allow you to stop there.
Thank you.
But I just wanted to sort of point to one more thing, because, I mean, again, you're charged with pushing solar or popularizing solar. Everybody comes back with the story on critical minerals. How big of a challenge it is? I mean, Lord Turner gave us a sense of how it's different and not as big a challenge as we make it out to be. But why are we, I mean, is that also just vested interest? I'll allow you to have a go at it as well.
You know, I agree with Lord Turner that this is made out to be a larger problem than it is. But it needs to be a problem. You see, when it becomes a problem, there are three kinds of things that happen. The first is more exploration happens. For example, lithium is said to be a critical mineral. We, in India, did a geological survey in Jammu and Kashmir in the late 1960s. We found bauxite there. Now we went to look for bauxite, we also found lithium there. In 1960s, we were not even looking for lithium. So one of the things by adding it to the list of critical minerals is that now you look for it. So the first thing that happens is you add to what is available. The second is, because of competitive pressures, the amount of lithium used in every battery reduces over time. So today, a battery uses 10% less lithium than it did 7 or 8 years ago. And the third thing that happens is, because lithium is not available in every part of the world, you start seeing not in-kind substitutes coming up. For example, sodium batteries. Recently you saw that Volkswagen has started bringing their electric cars with sodium batteries. Sodium is far more available across the globe than is lithium. These not-in-kind substitutes help in ensuring that the price of the critical minerals remains at a level that the industry is able and willing to pay.
Well, I think actually Ajay said most of what needs to be said. We produced at the Energy Transition Commission last year a report in July called Minerals and Resources for the Energy Transition, and it sets out many of these arguments. I mean, basically, if you look at all the minerals we need, the silver, the nickel, the cobalt, etc., there is plenty of it in the world. And as Ajay has said, once you get technical innovation and once we get recycling, there really are no fundamental supply constraints. And it's the realization of that which has meant that actually in 2022 everybody was saying there isn't nearly enough lithium in the world. Look, the price of lithium hydroxide has gone up 5 times. It's actually fallen 85% since then, as people have realized just how big the supplies are. So I think it is fundamentally a manageable challenge, but we do need to foresee it, develop the supply, keep that technical innovation going. That means we reduce the needs. And then finally, we do need to manage the local environmental impacts. If you take nickel, the belief that there would be a shortage of nickel, which was very widespread 2 years ago, has completely disappeared as a result of the enormous increases in nickel supply from Indonesia. But quite a lot of this is being done in a terribly environmentally destructive fashion. So we also need on these mineral supplies to impose clear, traceable, life cycle, environmental standards on how they are produced. But as long as we do that, and as long as we have the innovation and recycling, this is a completely manageable problem. It is not a barrier to the massive energy transition that we need.
Sumant, as the person who has to actually do this in a manner that you're responsible to shareholders, I was wondering, how do you look at this critical mineral question?
You know, actually, where we come across critical minerals is really in the area of batteries more than anything else. And right now, you know, we are just users of whatever is the most commonly available and cheapest technology. And today, at least, as Adair said, prices of batteries have come down dramatically. And so we're happy about that. Whenever they go up, obviously we'll have to build that in to our numbers. So that's how we think about it. We're just users of whatever's happening in the world.
So you more or less think that it is, as both of them said, a manageable challenge?
I think so, because I also believe in human ingenuity. And so if things become difficult for one mineral and people are finding it's not available, then I'm sure we'll find some other solutions. As Ajay was saying, it could be sodium batteries, right? So I think those kinds of solutions will become available over time.
When we did our report, it's quite surprising what we ended up most worried about. And it's the one that is difficult to substitute away from. So if I take cobalt, 5 years ago everybody was terrified about the lack of supply of cobalt, but also the fact that most cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So if you're making an electric vehicle with a battery with cobalt from the DRC, you were worried about, you're going to find out there was child labor, artisanal labor, corruption, you know, etc. So along came the technical innovation, and we reduced the need for cobalt in batteries by about 6 times. right? In the course of just 3 or 4 years. We designed the cobalt out of the batteries, and as a result, the price of cobalt has collapsed. The one we're most worried about, actually, is copper. Because copper, we have been using for hundreds of years, so unlike with lithium and others, we're not at the early stages of a discovery process, and actually copper yields in copper mines have been gradually declining. We have to shift more rock, more tons of rock for ounce of copper each year. And it's much more difficult to substitute. Now, there will be ways around it. There are enormous copper mines being opened, for instance, absolutely enormous one in southern Mongolia by Rio Tinto, and it is manageable. But if I had one product which I think, may be high price, and therefore where it would be great if we could have technological innovation, it's copper. All the rest, I think we may actually be surprised over time more by gluts than by scarcity.
Okay, we'll take a bit of a break in the sense that there is a video message from Dr. Damilola Ogunbi. If you can cue that, please. And when we are done with that, I'll come to you, Dr. Vijaykumar. And the reason why I was asking Gavin to go slow on finance is that was the entire question. That's the problem of having blank somewhere in your credentials.
Distinguished delegates, it is my pleasure to address you today. First, I want to congratulate TERI on this summit and extend my sincere apologies for not being there with you in person. Today's challenges for attaining sustainable development are complex and interconnected. We therefore need to work together towards creating a more sustainable future. It's for this reason that this year's World Sustainable Development Summit is extremely timely. With its umbrella theme of leadership for sustainable development and climate justice, this summit is a perfect platform to discuss how we can harness our collective leadership to accelerate sustainable development and push for greater climate action across the world. I therefore call on you as thought leaders, policymakers, and experts from various fields to develop the solutions needed to accelerate just and inclusive energy transitions across the world that will not only accelerate economic progress and development, but also slash emissions that are rapidly warming our planet. As I conclude, I would like to thank the organizers for convening this important event. The Energy and Resource Institute, TERI, has been at the forefront of driving innovation and effecting positive change in the fields of energy, environment, climate change, and sustainable development. And we at Sustainable Energy for All are proud to be partnering with such an illustrious organization. I'm encouraged that this 23rd edition of the World Sustainable Development Summit has brought together a hugely diverse group of change makers. It is a perfect gathering that can accelerate action and ambition towards a more sustainable and equitable world for present and future generations. I wish you productive deliberations and look forward to the actionable solutions that you will come up with. Thank you for your interest and your attention.
So Dr. Vijaytunga, the big question, money, which obviously everybody has touched upon, except someone who I asked not to touch upon it, but everybody has that top of mind. And I'm wondering if you could address that question about money flowing to the right places, money doing the right things, money being used in a manner that's sustainable, and ensuring that that investment itself is sustainable.
Thank you very much, Urmi. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be in this leadership panel and with all the distinguished speakers here. And also, I should thank TERI for inviting ADB to be in this panel. And we have had quite a long relationship, ADB and TERI, over 40 years, most probably, that's what I heard. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And in fact, just to add to what one of my speakers said, when it comes to critical minerals, In fact, interestingly, we have to look at when you get these critical minerals out of the earth, what kind of power which you would be using in these mines. Frankly, recently we had to deal with two particular projects issues. One, of course, probably the copper mine which you were referring to in Mongolia. The power comes from a huge coal power plant. Right, that's an issue. And then we are now looking at another project in Pakistan, again, in a very isolated place where probably the power supply will have to be from one of the fossil fuel sources, and I don't know which one it would be. And it's a dilemma which we all are in, which we need to look at very carefully. And one thing to start with on the financing question, one thing I should start off with by saying that unlike those good old times, environmental sustainability and the development, they are not mutually exclusive. So we can do both together. That's one most important thing, simply because the renewable energy, the clean energy prices, the costs have come down drastically. That has helped for us to make sure that these two go together, not mutually exclusive. But at the same time, we all know you need lots of money to bring clean energy solutions, trillions of dollars every year. And government budgets cannot do it alone, and we need to have the private sector. So that also should be very well understood. So we can bring in money, but it's only a small fraction of what is needed. So all what we can do on the sovereign side in particular is we should try to leverage as much as possible. Every dollar we spend from sovereign side will have to leverage many more dollars in the private sector. That's something which we have to understand. So from our side, as one of the important multilateral banks, particularly very strong in this region, Asia-Pacific region, we ourselves have elevated our climate ambition to $100 billion. It's not a lot of money, but as I said, you can leverage a lot more money with that from 2019 to 2030. And this is, of course, originally we had 80 billion, now we have elevated that to $100 billion. And also we have unlocked another $100 billion for the next decade through our capital adequacy framework. And that means additional funding, again, to leverage more capital investment from the private sector. And the other important thing I should mention here is that most of you all must be knowing that we revised our energy policy in 2021. Fortunately, I was leading that process, and it was not an easy task. And for us to put up another energy policy in kind of controversies we have to go through, you have the dilemma of balancing energy access with environmental sustainability and many other things. So eventually we came up with this energy policy which addresses all these issues and in fact quite a balanced energy policy. And with that, we managed to bring in the environmental sustainability and energy access together as something which we can address. And there we are very clear, we are not going to finance any coal-fired assets. That's very clear for the first time. I think probably the only MDB which came up with this at the very beginning as the first. And then even when it comes to financing things like gas, we are very restrictive. We have very strong screening criteria and very critical requirements to meet if you have to finance gas infrastructure. So I don't want to go into details too much, but one important thing is that ADB has last year provided about $2.5 billion, but we used to historically provide about $5 billion a year in energy sector financing, and hopefully we'll get back to this because of the pandemic. The numbers have gone down, but we have to eventually come to about $8 to $9 billion a year of energy sector financing as we go along. So all this money is available, and I can give you many examples of what we have been doing in recent times. All projects are on energy transition projects. They are not anything else. It's all on energy transition. We are not doing anything beyond that at the moment, and it will continue to be that way, in the future. And on top of that, we have started looking at manufacturing side, which is also very important, as it was just talked about just now. because the need to diversify manufacturing, as you know, it's all concentrated in some regions and some countries, and it's important to bring that diversification, not only when it comes to minerals, but also manufacturing, simply to make sure that your energy security is brought in. And to conclude, in fact, we have three challenges. First, of course, this region is highly dependent on coal. We need to address that issue. So we should not be looking at only the assets to come, but the existing assets. So with this kept in mind, ADB has brought in this energy transition mechanism, as you know, which was announced in Glasgow, where we are trying to phase out or phase down coal-fired power plants as much as possible, while balancing that with clean energy development. That's one thing which we need to address in this region. Secondly, governments have very ambitious national determined contributions, but there is no action on the ground, because again, there is no enough adequate money, or maybe no enough capacity to bring in policies and regulations. So we are supporting in that process. And when it comes to financing, as I said, we are trying to bring in as much financing as possible from sovereign side, but we need to leverage private sector financing. In this we will bring in the form of policy-based loans, as well as results-based loans as much as possible. And the third is, of course, some of the countries are in financial distress, right? And particularly the smaller countries. And we need to bring in grant financing and some kind of financing facilities to help these countries to come out of this situation, because otherwise they have to feed their people first before thinking of sustainable energy sector development, right? So we have to bring in this concessional financing to support them. So these are some of the things we need to look at, and we have some initiatives to address these three issues, and hopefully we'll be able to do a lot more as we move forward, as we call it Climate Bank of the Asia and the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Walter, the thing that keeps coming back to me when we are talking about all this, and as I hear everyone, we just came back from a COP, we just had a COP, and one of the things we notice, or seems to be, that there's still, we are in a sort of fragmented world in some ways, and that's a risk we have to deal with, or that's an issue. How do we actually manage to get a more global sort of move, not just through, I can see you smiling almost like I've poked the bear, but where do you see this going? No, I didn't call you the bear, the issue being the bear.
Well, I would like to focus a little differently on energy security, the first leg of the trilemma, and mindful of two basic things. First, that energy is not an end in itself. It is a means to fuel global and national economic and social development. We all agree it should be cleaner energy, used more efficiently, and it should be affordable to many more people than have access to it today, and all this to promote our energy security. The second thing we have to be very mindful of, and I think increasingly so, is the disruptive geopolitics of our day. From the war zones in Ukraine and Gaza to conflict and tension also elsewhere. This affects the core interests of nations, as well as their energy policies and their climate policies. And all this undermines the global cooperation that we need to meet shared challenges. Many say that our world is one of polycrisis. I would suggest the less pessimistic poly-change. We have geopolitical change, we have demographic change, economic change, energy change, and climate change. All of these things spilling into each other. And we have political polarization, disparities and inequality in countries and among countries. And we are mismanaging the environment to the peril of our planet. This backdrop invites shared gloom. but let it instead underscore the need for all stakeholders to speak up for a more sustainable world order, and more importantly, to do something about it. Citizens across the world expect their governments to deliver energy security. What is more, they also expect their governments to deliver military security, economic security, social security, food security, and now in our days, not least, climate security. And citizens everywhere expect their governments to put their country first. I'm sure that all governments would want to do the right thing for the global good. But they are faced with constraints and must prioritize and compromise, delivering on these many security imperatives. And they must also compromise and prioritize when delivering among the 3 E's of the energy trilemma. One can only be impressed by all that is being done in India and elsewhere, not least by members of this panel, to develop and scale up renewable energy options. But we are transitioning away from fossil fuels. But contrary to global ambition and the COP28 call for transitions away from fossil fuels, demand for fossil fuels is still increasing. Fossil fuels will remain for some time crucial for the energy security of many countries. And this is something we have to recognize when addressing the energy trilemma on a global basis. A final point, that countries are different. They have differentiated capabilities, they have differentiated responsibilities. All this determined by their national circumstances. And governments jealously guard their sovereign right to determine their own policies for energy security. In all this, we need more international cooperation among countries, across political and economic dividing lines. And business has an increasingly important role to play. A new public-private energy partnership with global reach is required, pushed by technological innovation, an impatient society, and people like you in the media. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sethi, I come to you. It's to the last speaker, but I promise you're not the least. For the simple reason is that I'll ask you to focus on the energy trilemma as it bears out in industry and the role of research and development. Again, you know, everybody's touched a bit upon it, and I'm wondering if you could speak to how that presents a challenge.
Yeah, thanks. I think you're absolutely correct. I think most of the speakers here have actually, including Suman Sinha, Dr. Mathur, everybody has talked on the supply side, I think. And of course, that is important. I think we need to decarbonize the energy supply, of course, the path. To me, I personally believe, I think the pathway on the supply side is pretty clear today, if we really look at it. Of course, there are challenges, barriers, issues of critical minerals. We know one has to move to solar, wind, you need batteries, you need pumped hydro, you need storage, everything is clear. Or at least the path is clear. But when it comes to the demand side and on the other side, I think there are still a bit fuzzy, not very clear in many cases, and one needs to really invest in R&D and innovation in many of these areas where I think emphasis has to be there. So I'll just to paraphrase this, what I'm saying, if you really look at, today I'm coming from India, I have been working in the industry space for more than 30, 35 years. But if you look at India, almost 50%, or as per the last statistics, 56% of the total energy which is consumed in this country is actually going to industries. And out of this 56%, almost 50% of it actually is in these large industries, big ones, cement, steel, petrochemical, fertilizers, ammonia. And in these industries, I think I would like to mention that these industries like cement or ammonia, we have plants in India which are very efficient in terms of the specific energy consumption. I see Mr. Singhi sitting from Dalmia Cements here. I think the plant which he heads is actually the most efficient plant globally in terms of the specific energy consumption. But it is the balance 30-40% which is in the small and medium enterprises. I think they are extremely important. And there we need to really focus quite a lot on efficiency improvement. we keep on saying efficiency is the low-hanging fruit, but to me it has remained low-hanging for quite a long time, and we really need to pluck that fruit and show it to the world that things can happen. We at TERI, I think I can say Dr. Mathur was part of TERI at that time, and we worked with some of these small and medium enterprises in places like small places in Firozabad or in Howrah, where actually you need dedicated programs to see that these whole industries really move to the most efficient pathways. And I think somehow we are lacking on that. So to me, innovation in terms of not just the technology, innovation in terms of the partnerships and the programs which we need to have for getting these industries moved to this efficient pathways. So to me, short to medium term, we must continue focusing on that. Second point I just wanted to focus, I think, on this is also again on the industry. If we really look at the pattern of energy consumption in the industry sector, we did some back of the envelope calculations. And this brings me to also to what Lord Adair Turner mentioned. Almost 70 to 80% of the energy which is consumed in the industries is in the form of heat, not in the form of electricity. As the grid decarbonizes, electrical energy will get decarbonized pretty clear. But what is actually important is how do you decarbonize this heat? And I think to me the focus has to now shift to really decarbonizing this heat in these industries. And we have also done some small exercise to see what kind of heat is it. Is it low temperature heat or is it high temperature heat? High temperature heat in forms of furnaces, which is 1400 degrees centigrade in the kilns which you have in cement kilns. In refractory industry, 1500 degrees centigrade. All these materials are going to increase. Steel industry, they are very high. Brick industry is such a big industry, it uses coal as much as cement industry uses. And nobody wants to really work on innovation and R&D, how you really convert these into non-fossil. And all these are using coal. So to me, a lot of investment needs to be focused on developing some innovation not in terms of both the technologies which have to go. Electrification of kiln has been talked about, I think, in this. But to me, I think the global efforts in really working towards an electrified kiln or electrified cracker is somewhat lacking today. So to me, and these materials are going to increase manifold. We have done some exercises, I think. We are working with the Global Cement and Concrete Association here. That, for example, both materials like cement and steel, they are going to increase their production capacities by 3 to 4 times in the next 30 years or so. Cement is going to increase from 330 to close to around 1100, 1200 by 2050. And if we are going to have all these new assets which are going to be on the same old technology, then we are going to end up with a story of stranded assets. To me, I think R&D innovation in these new technologies, new materials will have to really play an important role as we move forward. And I think, to me, in this space, I would just like to single out 2 sectors actually, which really are extremely important if we want us to really work, not just in India, I think globally as well. To me, I think many of the things are not happening even in Europe and USA at that fast pace as one would like to see, are the sector like cement and steel. In India, 80% of the energy actually is mitigation potential from these 6 is actually from these 2 sectors. And lastly, I also wanted to mention that as we decarbonize, I think it's equally important to see that how do we really create the demand for these low carbon products. See, unless and until there is a demand for a low carbon steel or a low carbon cement, it's not very easy for the industry players to really shift and start producing. One has to accept that these technologies, as of today, are costlier in terms of the capital cost. As the technology matures, as the cost for green hydrogen comes down, hydrogen DRI can become cheaper and we'll be able to see that. But I think that's something very important which one has to really see. And I think something which is very typical as the last one, which I also wanted to see, is the price of the energy which is delivered. I think in India, we are actually, in many of the industries, when we go to the field, they say, oh, I'm getting electricity at 10 rupees a unit.
Yeah.
And when you start comparing it with here, if there is a commercial technology available where maybe you can do it with coal and it is cheaper, so the industry fellow is going to do. So we need to develop a model where he can be incentivized to shift to electricity, or there has to be some way to do that.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Turner, you wanted to add something on the industrial side.
I just wanted to very strongly enforce what Girish said about the importance of the research and development of techniques to deal with higher temperature heat. I think you've got to break it into medium temperature and then really high. So I think in the sort of 100 degree up to 400 degree, the sort of stuff that's used in food processing or in textiles, it is highly likely that it is forms of heat pump technology, and we increasingly think that will be the answer there. But when you get up to what people call calcination temperatures, 1,000 degrees and higher, heat pumps like that will not provide the answer. But there are an increasing set of technologies available. I was recently in Australia, in Gladstone, up in the northeast, at an alumina refinery. Now, alumina refining, not the electrolysis process, but the process of producing the alumina which goes in to an aluminum production process, that is a 1,000 degree temperature heat, and they are experimenting with ideas of how to fully electrify it. There are lots of different ideas. A very interesting company from Finland called Coolbrook, which basically does a kinetic to heat translation. Because we have to remember that energy is ultimately two things. It's either heat or it's work. And most of what we're doing in the energy system is either converting heat to work or work to heat. And this is a very simple thing. You just spin huge weights at a very great speed, which creates a lot of kinetic energy. And as you slow them down, you release heat. And if you can capture that heat. So there's a huge amount of innovation going on, but it's a crucial area on which governments and across the world we now have to concentrate. We know the answer in some sectors of the economy. Passenger cars, it's electric vehicles, just get on with it. There are others where we still need to develop these technologies which are crucial.
Sumant, very quickly, I wanted you to, if you could touch on this thing about how, because of the kind of pricing systems that exist, not just in this country, but in many other countries, it kind of disincentivizes electrification. And what, where do you see that conversation going?
So I think that we need to develop some of these newer technologies that can allow us to electrify more sectors at a price that is sensible for the user industries. Because I think at this point, even though everybody wants us to deal with climate change, nobody is really willing to pay any price for it, unfortunately. That's the sad truth of where we are. So I think we have to therefore use technology to bring down costs as much as possible. Now, we know that green hydrogen is one such sort of new product that can actually help us address a lot of these areas, and that's fundamentally based on electrification and renewable energy. So I think that could be a solution that emerges and certainly can go into sustainable aviation fuel, certainly can go into fuel cells, can go into shipping. So I think those areas it can definitely, I think solutions are available. How it can go into things like the steel industry and so on, I think there's a lot of work going on. And blending it into, for example, thermal plants, that is also something that is being done. I think the costs are still a little bit higher, they need to come down.
The thing is that this conversation can go on for a longer time. Unfortunately, we are on the clock, and I believe it's a hard stop, and the hard stop comes now. So I want to thank all of you for your time and for trying to address questions that were raised, good, bad, and different, but thank you so much for entertaining them. And I know that we haven't found a solution, but maybe we're we hit on something. So thank you so much for your time once again. And thank you for being such a patient audience.
Yeah, group photo.
Thank you to the panelists and participants for shedding lights. We are thrilled to kickstart our event, TERI at the 50, the role of Knowledge Institute in driving leadership and change, event at Stain Auditorium. For those holding invitation cards, I repeat, those having physical invitation cards, please proceed to Stain Auditorium and be seated by 5:30 for security clearance. Additionally, for those who are not having invitation cards, the session will be broadcasted in this hall, Silver Oak, and be seated by 5. Refreshments are available at Hub. I also hope that audiences tagging us at the social media site with #Act4Earth and WSDS 2024. Thank you for joining us.